She texted him at 4 in the morning, saying she felt strange, almost drugged. 3 hours later, she was in the hospital, confused and scared. Her husband sat beside her bed, holding her hand, whispering that everything would be okay. But when she went home and drank another protein shake the next morning, the symptoms came back, only this time they were worse. By the third hospital visit, she couldn't speak anymore. Her body was shutting down, and the doctors had no idea why. Her husband stood in the hallway, tears streaming down his face, begging them to save her. But what nobody knew, not the doctors, not her family, not even her closest friends, was that the man crying in that hospital corridor was the same man who had been slowly poisoning her for weeks. And when she finally took her last breath, he didn't mourn. He went home and searched the internet for one thing: how to cover up a murder. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Rebecca Porter was 39 years old when she disappeared on New Year's Day 2023. She was a corporate real estate manager who split her time between her family home in a quiet Massachusetts suburb and her job in Washington, D.C. Friends and co-workers described her as a force to be reckoned with, a supermom who somehow managed to balance a demanding career with raising 3 young sons, all under the age of 7. She was the kind of woman who could walk into a boardroom and command respect, then come home and help with homework without missing a beat. Her Instagram was filled with photos of family trips to the beach, birthday parties, and candid moments of her boys laughing in the backyard. From the outside, Rebecca's life looked perfect: a successful career, a beautiful home, 3 healthy children, and a husband, David Porter, who seemed devoted to his family. David was 47, charming in a quiet way, the kind of man who could talk about art and literature for hours. He came from money, old money, the kind that came with expectations and pressure. But beneath that polished exterior, David was hiding secrets that would eventually unravel everything. In 2021, David had pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges involving the sale of fake Andy Warhol paintings. He'd taken 2 authentic shadow paintings from a friend in South Korea, sold them on eBay for $100,000, and replaced them with forgeries. When the buyer discovered the canvases looked brand new and had no authentication stamps, David's scheme fell apart. He was sentenced to 37 months in prison and ordered to pay back nearly $500,000 in restitution. But as of January 2023, he hadn't started serving his sentence yet. He was on house arrest, wearing an ankle monitor, waiting to be sent away, and that wait was destroying him. By late 2022, Rebecca and David's marriage was falling apart. They slept in separate bedrooms. They barely spoke unless it was about the kids or logistics. Rebecca had confided in close friends that she was planning to leave David, that she wanted to move the children to Washington, D.C. permanently so they could have a stable life while he served his prison time. She'd even started preparing her D.C. apartment for the boys, buying clothes and toys, setting up bedrooms. But there was something else Rebecca hadn't told David, something she'd kept hidden for months. She was having an affair. The man's name was Michael, and he worked in D.C. They'd met through mutual friends, and what started as casual conversation had turned into something more. By Thanksgiving 2022, Rebecca and Michael had traveled to Ireland together, spending a week exploring Dublin and the countryside. They spent Christmas Eve together. They made plans to celebrate New Year's together on January 4th, after Rebecca returned from a quick trip to Massachusetts to see her kids. Phone records would later show that Michael was Rebecca's most frequent contact, that they spoke or texted nearly every day. Friends who knew about the affair said Rebecca seemed happier than she'd been in years, that she finally felt like herself again. But what Rebecca didn't know was that David suspected something. In late December, David had been obsessively checking the Instagram page of one of Rebecca's male friends. Then, on December 26th, David's mother hired a private investigator to follow Rebecca in Washington, D.C. David wanted proof. He wanted to know if his wife was cheating on him, and more importantly, He wanted to know if she was planning to leave him for good. New Year's Eve. 2022 was quiet at the Porter home. Rebecca had flown back to Massachusetts to spend a few days with the boys before heading back to D.C. for work. David invited a friend over for dinner, and the three of them, Rebecca, David, and the friend, sat around the kitchen table making small talk. The kids were already asleep upstairs. Rebecca seemed distracted, checking her phone occasionally, probably texting Michael. After dinner, the friend left around 10 p.m. Rebecca stayed up a little while longer, calling her mother, her sister, and her maid of honor, though none of them answered. She wanted to talk to someone, to share her plans for the new year, to tell them she was finally ready to move forward with her life. At around 4 a.m. on January 1st, Rebecca was last seen alive in her home. David would later tell police that Rebecca left the house sometime between 4 and 6 a.m. to catch a rideshare to the airport for an emergency work trip. He said she'd been called in last minute, that she had to fly to D.C. immediately. But investigators could never confirm that story. There was no record of Rebecca booking a rideshare. No Uber or Lyft driver remembered picking her up. Her credit cards and debit cards hadn't been used since January 1st. And most damning of all, her cell phone continued to ping near the house until around 3 a.m. on January 2nd, a full day after David claimed she'd left for the airport. Rebecca's employer, a major real estate firm, reported her missing on January 4th when she didn't show up for work and didn't answer any calls or emails. When police arrived at the Porter home to question David, he seemed calm, almost too calm. He repeated his story about the emergency work trip, insisting that Rebecca must have gotten caught up with something in D.C. But detectives noticed small details that didn't add up. The house smelled faintly of cleaning products. David seemed nervous when they asked to search the basement, and when officers looked closer, they found something that made their blood run cold. In the basement of the Porter home, investigators discovered bloodstains on the floor and a damaged kitchen knife that tested positive for human blood. Upstairs, in David's car, they found more blood and traces of DNA that would later be matched to Rebecca. David had placed a plastic liner in the back of his car around the time Rebecca disappeared, but when questioned about it days later, he claimed he'd thrown it away. Surveillance footage from the area told a different story. On January 2nd, the day after Rebecca vanished, cameras captured David's Volvo making multiple trips to apartment complexes in neighboring towns. The footage showed a figure matching David's description, throwing large black trash bags into dumpsters at each location. Investigators obtained warrants to search those dumpsters, and what they found was horrifying. Inside the bags were blood-stained towels, cleaning supplies, a hacksaw, a hatchet, and items belonging to Rebecca, including her COVID vaccination card, a Prada purse she'd been carrying on New Year's Eve, and part of a necklace she could be seen wearing in family photos. DNA testing confirmed that both Rebecca and David's DNA were on several of the items, including a pair of slippers and a protective Tyvek suit, the kind used in crime scene cleanup. But the most chilling evidence came from David's internet search history. Investigators seized David's phone and his son's iPad, and what they discovered painted a picture of premeditation that was almost impossible to believe. Starting in the early morning hours of January 1st, just hours after Rebecca was last seen alive, David began searching for very specific information. At 4:55 a.m., he typed, "How long before a body starts to smell?" 3 minutes later, he searched, "How to stop a body from decomposing?" At 5:47 a.m., he searched, "10 ways to dispose of a dead body if you really need to." Over the next few days, the searches continued. Can you be charged with murder without a body? Dismemberment, and the best ways to dispose of a body. How to clean blood from concrete. What does formaldehyde do? Each search was a breadcrumb, a digital trail that led directly back to David. But the searches didn't start on New Year's Day. In late December, just days before Rebecca disappeared, David had also searched best state for divorce. Prosecutors would later argue that David realized divorce would mean losing access to Rebecca's income, losing custody of his children, and losing control over his life. And with a federal prison sentence looming, David couldn't afford to lose anything else. So he made a choice. If he couldn't have Rebecca, no one would. On January 8, 2023, David was arrested and charged with misleading investigators about his whereabouts on the day Rebecca disappeared. He claimed he'd been running errands, visiting his mother in a nearby town, stopping at a pharmacy, but surveillance footage and cell phone records proved he was lying. He'd made an undisclosed trip to Home Depot on January 2nd, where he spent over $450 on cleaning supplies, including mops, buckets, tarps, and industrial-strength cleaners, the kind of supplies you'd need to scrub a crime scene. 10 days later, on January 18th, David was arrested again, this time on charges of first-degree murder and disinterring a body without authority. Prosecutors stood before the court and laid out their case in brutal detail. They alleged that David had killed Rebecca in their home, dismembered her body, and disposed of the remains in multiple locations to avoid detection. They argued that David's motive was clear. He didn't want a divorce. He didn't want to lose his children. He didn't want to face the reality that his wife had moved on and was planning a new life without him. And most of all, he stood to gain $2.7 million from Rebecca's life insurance policy, money he desperately needed to pay off his fraud restitution and legal fees. When David appeared in court for his arraignment, he pleaded not guilty. His defense attorney argued that there was no body, no definitive proof that Rebecca was dead. She pointed out that in Massachusetts, a missing person isn't presumed dead for 7 years, and that Rebecca could have simply disappeared on her own. But the evidence against David was overwhelming. The blood in the basement, the DNA on the discarded items, the internet searches, the surveillance footage, the lies he told investigators, and the timeline that proved Rebecca never left the house the way David claimed. In March 2023, a grand jury indicted David on charges of first-degree murder, misleading a police investigation, and improper conveyance of a human body. The case moved from district court to superior court, and David was held without bail at the Norfolk County House of Corrections. His 3 sons, now 6, 4, and 2 years old, were placed in the custody of the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families. Relatives on both sides of the family fought for custody, desperate to keep the boys together. But the trauma of losing both parents, one to death and one to prison, would scar those children forever. As the investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged. Prosecutors revealed that David had suspected Rebecca's affair and had hired a private investigator to follow her in Washington, D.C. The investigator had compiled reports on Rebecca's movements, documenting her meetings with Michael, her trips to restaurants and coffee shops, her time spent at her D.C. apartment. David knew. He knew his wife was planning to leave him. He knew she was in love with someone else, and instead of letting her go, he decided to destroy her. Friends of Rebecca who testified during pretrial hearings described her as a woman who was finally finding happiness again after years of feeling trapped. They said she talked about her plans for the future, about moving the boys to D.C., about starting fresh. She was excited, she was hopeful. She had no idea that her husband was plotting her murder. Michael, the man Rebecca had been seeing, was devastated when he learned what happened. He told investigators that he and Rebecca had made plans to spend New Year's Day together, that she was supposed to fly back to D.C. on January 1st. When she didn't show up and didn't answer his calls, he assumed she'd changed her mind or gotten caught up with family obligations. It never occurred to him that she was already dead. He would later say in interviews that he blamed himself, that he wondered if things would have been different if he'd insisted she stay in D.C. instead of going back to Massachusetts. But the truth is, David's plan was already in motion. Rebecca never stood a chance. In September 2025, just weeks before David's trial was set to begin, another shocking development occurred. David was assaulted in jail by another inmate who stabbed him with a makeshift weapon. He was rushed to a Boston hospital, treated for his injuries, and returned to the facility overnight. The attack raised concerns about his safety and whether he was being properly monitored. Former law enforcement officials speculated that other inmates likely knew about David's case from television and internet access, and that crimes against women and children are especially despised in prison. David's trial is now scheduled to begin in October 2025. If convicted of first-degree murder, he faces life in prison without the possibility of parole. Prosecutors are prepared to present the internet searches, the surveillance footage, the DNA evidence, and testimony from investigators and forensic experts. David's defense team has argued that the evidence was obtained illegally, that the Google searches don't prove he killed his wife, and that without a body the case is circumstantial. But legal experts say that won't be enough. The totality of the evidence, the timeline, the lies, the blood, the dismemberment tools, all point to one conclusion. David Porter killed his wife, cut her body into pieces, and scattered the remains across multiple locations to avoid detection, and he almost got away with it. Rebecca's body has never been found. Despite extensive searches of landfills, wooded areas, and waterways, investigators have been unable to locate her remains. Her family has begged David to tell them where she is, to give them closure, to let them bring her home and give her a proper burial. But David has refused to cooperate. He maintains his innocence, insisting that Rebecca simply disappeared and that he had nothing to do with it. As of today, Rebecca's 3 young sons are being raised by family members who are doing their best to shield them from the horror of what happened. But those boys will grow up knowing that their father murdered their mother. They'll grow up without her hugs, her laughter, her guidance. They'll grow up with questions that can never be fully answered, and all because one man couldn't accept that his marriage was over. So let me ask you something. How would you feel if you were Rebecca's mother, knowing your daughter's killer refuses to tell you where her body is? How would you feel if you were one of those little boys trying to understand why your mommy isn't coming home? How would you feel if you were Michael, the man who loved Rebecca and had plans to build a future with her, only to learn she was murdered before she could escape? This case isn't just about a man who killed his wife. It's about control. It's about a husband who believed he owned his wife, that she was his property to do with as he pleased. It's about a man so consumed by ego and entitlement that he chose murder over letting her walk away. And it's a reminder that the most dangerous time for a woman in an abusive or controlling relationship is when she tries to leave. Rebecca Porter was a successful, intelligent, beloved woman who had her whole life ahead of her. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend. She deserved to live. She deserved to raise her children. She deserved to find happiness. But David Porter took all of that away from her in a single act of unthinkable violence. And now, as he sits in a jail cell awaiting trial, the world watches and waits for justice. Before you go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming true crime documentaries. Because the truth is, stories like Rebecca Porter's aren't as rare as we'd like to believe, and the next one could be happening right next door.